My friends, tonight I would have you consider a simple yet profound truth. To remember is to resurrect the past, but to forget is to give birth to the future. The creative power of imagination is the root from which all manifestations of life arise. Consciousness, the eternal reality, is not something external to us, but the very essence of our being. Everything we experience, whether called real or unreal, tangible or intangible, emerges from the activity of consciousness. When we grasp this truth, we begin to understand that imagination is not a fleeting daydream, nor a child's fancy, but the instrument of creation itself. It is imagination that shapes worlds, forms identities, and molds destiny. To recognize imagination as the true creative power is to awaken to the awareness that nothing exists independently of consciousness, and nothing endures apart from the sustained activity of mind. Consider the structure of daily life. Every action you perform originates first as an idea, an imaginal act, or a mental picture. You cannot lift a hand, write a word, or speak a thought without first imagining it. The unseen precedes the seen, and imagination supplies the unseen reality. The world calls the manifested outcome, while dismissing the inner cause as unreal. Yet the inner always precedes the outer. What you imagine with intensity, persistency, and conviction inevitably becomes fact in your experience, for imagination and faith are inseparable partners. Imagination creates the form, and faith sustains it until it hardens into objectivity. When we acknowledge consciousness as the only reality, we are invited to accept that every condition in our world is but the shadow of our inner state. Poverty, wealth, health, sickness, joy, or sorrow, each is nothing more than the reflection of what we have imagined ourselves to be. The mind, left unguided, replays old stories, revives stale images, and rehearses fears, thereby perpetuating the same outer conditions. But when we deliberately direct imagination, we lift ourselves out of the habitual state and step into a new reality. This is not a matter of forcing external circumstances. It is a matter of assuming within that which you desire to express without. Imagination does not ask permission from the world. It simply creates. Think of the artist who paints. Before a brush touches the canvas, before a stroke brings color to life, the image already exists within the artist's mind. The canvas is merely the echo, the reflection of the invisible act. So it is with all creation. Your life is the canvas, and imagination is the painter. What you dare to imagine with full acceptance must manifest. The limitation arises only when man confuses the canvas with a painter, when he believes the outer world holds power over the inner. But the reverse is true. The outer world is powerless without the inner directive. Consciousness alone animates the picture. This principle reveals that every human being is far greater than he supposes. The individual is not a helpless victim of circumstance, but the dreamer of his own dream. To dream consciously is to wield creative power. Yet most live in unconscious dreaming, allowing past memories, fears, and external influences to dictate their imaginal acts. In such cases, life seems accidental, chaotic, and ungoverned. But the moment one takes hold of imagination and direction with purpose, life becomes intentional. The dreamer awakens, and the dream changes. Imagination is the workshop of eternity. It is not limited by time or space, for it operates beyond the bounds of the physical senses. While the senses report what is, imagination declares what shall be. The senses may say you are ill, yet imagination, assuming health, will create health. The senses may whisper you are poor, yet imagination, claiming wealth, will fashion wealth. To rely on the senses alone is to bind oneself to the past, for the senses can only confirm what has already been imagined and expressed. But to rely on imagination is to step into the future, for imagination holds the seed of what will unfold. We see this illustrated in every invention. The airplane, the radio, the electric light, each began as a vision unseen by others. Before men ever soared through the sky, someone saw it in imagination. Before the world heard voices carried across invisible waves, someone heard it in imagination. Before darkness was banished by a bolt, someone saw the light in imagination. The world calls these men geniuses, but what they truly did was awaken to the truth that imagination is reality creating itself. They persisted in the imaginal vision until the outer world bowed to the inner decree. It is crucial, then, to recognize the responsibility that comes with imagination. For just as imagination creates joy, abundance, and freedom, it also creates sorrow, limitation, and bondage. Whatever you consent to imagine, whether in fear or faith, becomes your world. Imagination does not distinguish between good or bad, wanted or unwanted, simply brings forth what you impress upon it. This is why discipline of imagination is essential. To dwell continually on images of failure, sickness, or loss is to weave them into the fabric of experience. To imagine lovingly, constructively, and with confidence is to invite a harvest of good. The creative power of imagination is best exercised when we live from the end rather than merely thinking of the end. To think of the end is to place it outside yourself, always beyond reach. But to think from the end is to enter into it, to feel it as real here and now. When you imagine from the end, you are no longer a beggar asking for change. You are the creator decreeing it done. Imagination, when clothed in feeling, becomes the very state you occupy, and becomes states are creative. Your world must soon mirror the state you have chosen. To embrace imagination as the true power is to relinquish the false belief that external causes govern your life. Nothing comes to you except what you have imagined, knowingly or unknowingly. Your acceptance of this truth marks the beginning of freedom, for no man or condition can hold dominion over one who governs his imagination. When you govern imagination, you govern reality, for they are not two but one. Consciousness is the root, imagination the activity, and the world its fruit. To know this deeply is to know that you are never at the mercy of circumstance, but always the master of creation. The act of forgetting is one of the most vital disciplines in the transformation of consciousness. Forgetting is not mere negligence or loss of memory. It is a deliberate act of power, a conscious choice to release the grip of the past and step into a new identity. Every individual carries within themselves memories, impressions, and assumptions that shape the present moment. Yet transformation cannot occur while one clings to the echoes of yesterday. The old self, with its limitations, disappointments, and fixed beliefs, must be forgotten if the new self is to emerge. Forgetting is the gateway through which renewal passes, for no man can serve two masters, the old state and the new. One must die for the other to live. The old self is not a permanent entity. It is merely a state of consciousness, a pattern of imagination sustained by memory and attention. Each time you recall your failures, your inadequacy, or your sufferings, you breathe life into the old state, granting it continuity. You may long for change. You may affirm the desire for transformation. But as long as you carry the burden of remembrance, you remain bound to what was. Forgetting is the severing of this time. It is the conscious refusal to give energy to memories that contradict the self you now choose to embody. By forgetting, you do not deny the past. It may not have existed, but you refuse to let it define the present. You strip it of its authority, and in doing so, you liberate yourself. This act of forgetting requires faith. For the natural man clings to evidence, rehearsing again and again the testimony of the senses. He says, "This is who I was, and therefore this is who I must be." But the spiritual man understands that who he was is irrelevant, for he can choose anew. Forgetting becomes the highest form of faith, because it means letting go of the visible in order to embrace the invisible. When you forget the old state, you cast yourself wholly upon the unseen reality. The new, you say in effect, "I will remember it no more, for it no longer serves me. I live only in the vision of what I choose to be." In that act, transformation takes root. Think of the seed planted in the soil. If it clings to its former form, refusing to let go, it cannot grow. The husk must break, the old form must dissolve, for new life to appear. So it is with man. The former identity, the familiar limitations, the rehearsed narratives must be forgotten, allowed to dissolve, so that a new state of consciousness may take form. The forgetting is often uncomfortable, for man seeks security in what is known, even if what is known is painful. But the courage to forget opens to the unknown, which is where all true creation resides. Forgetting also demands discipline of imagination. The mind, left uncontrolled, returns habitually to the old stories, reviving past wounds and past identities. To practice forgetting, one must redirect the imagination, turning it away from the remembered wrongs and toward the vision of the desired self. Each time an old memory arises, it must be dismissed, not with repression, but with conscious substitution. Replace the image of failure with the image of success. Replace the memory of illness with the feeling of health. Replace the recollection of rejection with the acceptance of love. In doing this consistently, the old self fades, for what is not remembered ceases to exist in experience. The act of forgetting is not only personal, it is universal. Entire societies and cultures are bound by their memories of suffering, conflict, and division. They rehearse their collective wounds, ensuring their continuation. Yet when groups of people forget intentionally, when they choose to release the old narratives of hostility and step into the new story of unity, then true transformation occurs at the level of civilization. Forgetting, therefore, is the law not only of the individual, but of humanity itself. Renewal is impossible without it. Forgetting is also an act of mercy. To forget is to forgive, for forgiveness is not holding on to the injury. One may say, yet still remember, still relive the wound in imagination. But true forgiveness is forgetting. It is the refusal to call to mind the injury. In forgetting, the injury ceases to live. The mind is no longer chained to the offender or the offense, and the spirit is set free. This is why forgetting is essential for love. Love cannot dwell where remembrance of wrongs is nourished. Love flourishes only when the past is forgotten and a new state of harmony is assumed. In practical life, the act of forgetting transforms relationships, careers, health, and identity. If a man has failed repeatedly in business, he must forget those failure names he is to succeed. If he carries them into his present imagination, he repeats them. Forgetting wipes the slate clean, allowing him to stand as though he had never failed. If a woman has suffered illness for years, she must forget the history of her condition if she is to be healed. For as long as she remembers the days of pain, she sustains them. Forgetting means she no longer identifies with the body that once was sick but assumes now the body that is whole. If a person has been rejected in love, they must forget the rejections in order to experience acceptance. For remembrance binds them to loneliness, while forgetting opens the way for companionship. Forgetting is the hidden art of resurrection. Every resurrection begins with a death, and forgetting is the death of the old self. The tomb of memory must be sealed, and the stone rolled away before the new life can appear. The imagination, purified of its former images, becomes fertile ground for the new seed. The more thoroughly you forget, the more completely you are transformed. And though the world may remind you of what you once were, you need not accept its witness. You can reply silently within yourself, "That man is gone, I remember him no more. I am now what I choose to be." In this way, forgetting becomes not only a release but a declaration of authority, for it asserts the primacy of imagination over history. Intentional forgetting as faith is the conscious practice of releasing what has been in order to make room for what is desired. Faith, in its purest form, is not the belief that something might happen in the future, but the conviction that it already is. Yet this conviction cannot coexist with the continual remembrance of the old state. If a man wishes to embody wealth, but continually remembers his years of lack, he has not forgotten the old state and therefore does not possess true faith. Faith requires that the past be left behind entirely, that the mind and heart no longer akin to what was, but rest fully in the attention of what is now chosen. Forgetting becomes the very proof of faith, for one who truly believes has no need to recall what once contradicted the vision. To understand intentional forgetting as faith, one must first see that memory is creative. Each act of remembrance reaffirms the reality of what is remembered. If the mind dwells on loss, even after the event has passed, the state of loss is perpetuated. The individual continues to feel and live from it, making it alive in the present moment. But when forgetting is chosen deliberately, the memory loses its power and the old state dissolves. Faith is not concerned with keeping alive what no longer serves. Faith is concerned only with embodying the unseen reality of the desired state. To forget is to strip the old state of its creative force, thereby allowing the new state to take root. Faith always demands a death. Something must be left behind so that something else may arise. The old self, with its history, must be laid down, and this laying down is accomplished by forgetting. To remember a limitation is to resurrect it. To forget it is to bury it once and for all. Faith does not dwell upon former failures or rehearse stories of defeat. Faith acts as though those never existed. It lives only in the new assumption, breathing life into the unseen. Forgetting, then, is the gesture of faith. It is saying within, I will no longer recall what contradicts my vision, for my vision alone is true. And this kind of forgetting is not passive. It is not simply waiting for memories to fade over time. It is active, intentional, and disciplined. Each time the old self attempts to re itself through memory, faith chooses to turn away. Faith refuses to dwell upon it, refuses to nourish it, refuses to acknowledge it as real. Instead, it chooses again the new state. This refusal is not denial in the sense of ignoring reality. It is denial in the sense of giving no power to that which is no longer desired. By consciously forgetting, faith is demonstrated, for it shows that the individual no longer identifies with the past, but only with the new state. Faith and imagination work hand in hand. Faith forgets the past. Imagination supplies the vision of the future. Together, they create the present reality. When you imagine yourself as already being the person you desire to be, faith is the power that sustains the image by forgetting every trace of what you once were. Without forgetting, the imagination falters, for it is constantly contradicted by memory. But with forgetting, the imagination has free rein to create unhindered. Thus, intentional forgetting is not a side practice of faith. It is its very essence. To say you have faith while still remembering what was is to deceive yourself, for remembrance betrays doubt. True faith proves itself by its complete lack of interest in the old state. Consider the man who has lived in poverty for years. If he truly has new state of wealth, he must forget the struggles, the unpaid bills, the years of want. If he recalls them, he nourishes them and secretly identifies with them. But if he forgets them, he lives as though they never were. And in this living, the new state of wealth becomes real. Or take the woman who has suffered long with illness. If she has faith in health, she cannot rehearse the years of pain, cannot speak continually of the old diagnosis, cannot recall the testimony of weakness. Faith demands she forget it all, living now as one who is whole. Forgetting is not carelessness, but the deliberate act of faith, proving that the new state is her only reality. Intentional forgetting as faith also reveals the nature of time. What we call the past is nothing but memory sustained in the present. The past is not fixed. It is reimagined each time is recalled. To forget is to cease recalling, and thus the past is no more. Faith understands this truth and refuses to let the past dominate the present moment. Faith knows that the only reality is now, and now must be filled with the vision of the desired state. Forgetting is the method by which the now is cleansed of the old and prepared for the new. The practice of intentional forgetting also transforms relationships. If one holds on to memories of betrayal, disappointment, or injury, faith in love cannot flourish. The remembrance of wrong sustains the state of separation and pain. But to forget those wrongs is to live as though they never occurred, thereby embodying forgiveness and making love possible again. Faith in love requires forgetting all evidence to the contrary. It means looking upon another as though they had never failed you, for in your faith they stand redeemed. In every area of life, the same principle applies. Faith cannot be mixed with memory of the old state. The two cannot coexist. Faith says, I am, while memory whispers, you were. Faith lives in the present as though the vision is already real. Memory drags the past into the present, denying transformation. Therefore, faith must silence memory through forgetting. This forgetting is not weakness of mind, but strength of spirit. It is the refusal to allow imagination to be corrupted by what no longer serves. It is the conscious act of aligning with the new self and leaving the old self behind. Faith proves itself only in forgetting. If you still remember the chains, you are not yet free. If you still remember the sickness, you are not yet healed. If you still remember the failures, you are not yet successful. Forgetting them is the proof that faith has taken hold, for it shows you have no use for what once was. You walk in the new state as though you had never existed. Forgetting, therefore, is not a weakness of memory, but the strength of faith, which refuses to look back and insists upon looking only at the unseen vision of what is now living in the end, is the practice of dwelling entirely in the state of the wish fulfilled, to the point that the senses and the outer world lose their hold over your conviction. It is the art of assuming the reality of desire and persisting in that assumption until it crystallizes into fact. The natural man is led by appearances, continually reacting to what the senses report, believing that what is seen and heard dictates what can be. But the awakened man knows that appearances are shadows, effects, mere reflections of a deeper cause. To live in the end is to shift from being a victim of appearances to being the master of them. It is to declare that the inner reality, once assumed, is the only truth, regardless of how stubbornly the outer world contradicts it. The essence of this practice lies in persistence. Anyone can imagine the fulfillment of a desire for a fleeting moment, but living in the end requires that one hold that assumption steadily, returning to again, even when circumstances deny it. The senses may say, "You are poor," but living in the end means assuming wealth now, and feeling it as though it were already true. The body may say, "You are sick," but living in the end means imagining health and refusing to be moved by the testimony of pain. The world may say, "You are alone," but living in the end means embodying the feeling of companionship and love. To persist is to stand firm in the vision, knowing that the senses only reflect the past state, and that the new state, once assumed, must eventually take form. This practice requires discipline, for the senses are loud and persistent, demanding attention. They report lack, delay, and contradiction. But to live in the end is to forget the evidence of the senses, not by ignoring blindly, but by refusing to grant them authority. You may hear the news of lack, but you do not accept it as final. You may feel the pain of the body, but you refuse to let it define your state. You may see the absence of what you desire, but you know that what is absent to the senses is present imagination. In this refusal lies true mastery. The senses are not denied. They are stripped of their power to dictate your reality. Living in the end also transforms the very way you use imagination. Most people imagine from a place of lack, imagining their desires as something to be attained someday. They see the goal in the distance and long for it. But to live in the end is not to look in the desire from afar. It is to enter into it, to feel it real now, and to occupy it as though it were already fact. The difference is subtle yet profound. To think from the desire is to place it outside yourself. To think from the desire is to embody it. When you imagine from the end, you assume the identity of the one who already has what is wished. You feel the emotions, entertain the thoughts, and carry the inner conviction of the fulfilled state. This assumption becomes your dwelling place, and the outer world eventually reshapes itself to match it. The practice is not a matter of straining or forcing, but of resting in the feeling of accomplishment. When you live in the end, you no longer ask, "When will it come?" or "How will it happen?" For such questions betray that you are still living in the state of lack. Living in the end is calm and confident, for it knows that the seed has been planted and must bear fruit in its own season. It is the stillness of faith that refuses to be disturbed by appearances, even when the world seems unchanged, even when all evidence points to the contrary. You rest in the inner knowing that the unseen is more real than the seen. Living in the end is also creative in nature. By assuming the fulfillment of your desire, you call into being the conditions necessary for its manifestation. Life begins to rearrange itself. People and events align. Opportunities appeal. All because the inner assumption has taken root. The outer world is plastic to the imagination, And when the end is lived in, the world reshapes itself to reflect it. Yet the key is persistence. The moment you fall back into the old state, rehearsing the absence of what you want, you halt the process. The law exacts what you assume consistently. Therefore, persistence in living in the end ensures the inevitable realization of the desire. Living the end also liberates one from anxiety and struggle. To desire something without assuming it is to live in tension, for the mind is continually aware of the gap between what is and what is wanted. But to assume the end as already real is to close that gap. The desire is fulfilled inwardly, and thus the mind rests. This rest is not passive. It is the fertile ground in which creation unfolds. Anxiety looks outward, but faith looks inward. Living in the end is faith in action, for it demonstrates that you believe the unseen assumption more than the seen evidence. This principle applies to every aspect of life. In relationship, living in the end means assuming harmony and love, even if outer appearances show conflict. In health, it means assuming vitality and strength, even when the body speaks otherwise. In wealth, it means assuming abundance, even when the bank account shows lack. In self-identity, it means assuming greatness, even when the world remembers your failures. Each area responds to the same law of assume the end, persist in it, and forget the contradiction of the senses. The power of living in the end lies in its simplicity. It requires no external conditions, no elaborate rituals, no reliance on others. It asks only that you turn within and assume now the state you wish to express. The world may laugh, criticize, or deny, but the world is only the echo of the old state. To live in the end is to rise above appearances, to dwell in the unseen, and to know that what is unseen will soon be seen. It is the art of living from the wish fulfilled, a continual returning to the vision, until it becomes so natural that the senses themselves are compelled to agree. The role of discipline is the deliberate training of the mind to release unwanted memories and dwell only upon that which serves the new creation. The mind, left unattended, drifts into the past, rehearsing old failures, reliving injuries, and reviving patterns that contradict the state one wishes to embody. Discipline is the act of mastery, the conscious directing of thought so that the imagination becomes a servant of creation, rather than a prison of repetition. Without discipline, memory rules, and the old self continues to dominate. With discipline, imagination is purified, and the new state is allowed to take root and flourish. Discipline begins with awareness. One must first recognize the tendency of the mind to wander, to replay old events, and to feed upon what no longer serves. Every time a memory of limitation arises, it becomes an invitation to either the old state or release it. Discipline is the strength to release it. This release is not suppression, nor is it denial. It is the conscious refusal to identify with the unwanted memory. To dwell upon it is to give it life, but to turn away from it is to strip it of its creative power. Discipline trains the mind to starve the old by refusing to feed it, and to nourish the new by dwelling upon it consistently. The practice of discipline also requires substitution. It is not enough to merely resist an unwanted thought, for resistance alone often strengthens it. Instead, the disciplined mind replaces the old memory with the vision of the desired state. When the mind recalls failure, discipline replaces it with the imaginal picture of success. When the memory of sickness arises, discipline substitutes health. When the mind replays rejection, discipline introduces the feeling of love and acceptance. Over time, this practice rewires the imagination so that the old memories fade from lack of attention and the new images grow vivid and natural. Discipline demands persistence. The mind will not change its habits overnight, for years of repetition have strengthened the old patterns. But through consistent practice, the new becomes dominant. Each moment of awareness and redirection builds strength, like muscles trained through exercise. At first, the effort feels unnatural, as though one is forcing the mind against its will. But with practice, the mind learns obedience. Eventually, the new images and feelings become the natural dwelling place, and the old memories lose their hold entirely. This persistence is the hallmark of discipline, for without it, the mind falls back into its old ways. The role of discipline extends to imagination itself. The imagination is always creating, whether directed or not. Undisciplined imagination creates unconsciously, producing circumstances that mirror past fears and unwanted beliefs. Disciplined imagination creates consciously, shaping experiences in harmony with the chosen state. To discipline imagination is to decide deliberately what to dwell upon, and to refuse to indulge in idle or destructive visions. Every imaginal act is a seed planted in consciousness, and discipline ensures that only seeds of the desired harvest are sown. Without this vigilance, weeds of memory and fear choke the garden of creation. Discipline also frees the individual from bondage to the senses. The senses continually report the evidence of the old state, tempting the mind to recall and relive it. But discipline teaches the mind to look beyond appearances, to dwell in the unseen rather than the seen. It trains the individual to remember only what serves the new creation, ignoring the testimony of the senses when it contradicts the vision. This does not mean ignoring the outer world, but refusing to let it dictate inner reality. Discipline insists that the inner interruption and the senses must eventually conform. In relationships, the role of discipline becomes especially clear. The mind often recalls injuries, betrayals, or disappointments, and these memories poison the present. Discipline trains the individual to release such memories, to forget the wrongs, and to dwell upon the vision of harmony, love, and unity. By refusing to entertain old grievances, the disciplined mind creates new relationships, even with the same people, for it no longer projects the past into the present. This practice transforms interaction, for the other person is now met in the light of the new assumption rather than the shadow of old memory. In health, discipline is equally vital. The body may present symptoms, and the mind may recall long histories of illness. But discipline requires the refusal to dwell upon those memories. Each time the old condition attempts to dominate, the disciplined imagination affirms health, vitality, and strength. By persisting in this disciplined dwelling, the body itself is compelled to conform to the new image. Without discipline, the mind clings to the memory of sickness, ensuring its continuation. With discipline, the memory is forgot is allowed to manifest. Discipline also plays a role in identity. The old self is sustained entirely by memory. To continually remember past failures, past limitations, and past identities is to remain bound to them. Discipline demands the forgetting of the old self and the continual dwelling upon the chosen self. By refusing to recall who you once were, and by remembering only who you now choose to be, discipline dissolves the old identity and establishes the new. This is why discipline is the foundation of transformation. Without it, imagination is scattered, and the old state remains. With it, imagination is focused, and the new state is born. Discipline is not harshness or repression. It is love in action. To discipline the mind is to love oneself enough to no longer indulge in destructive memories or images. It is the kindness of guiding oneself away from bondage and into freedom. It is the recognition that the mind creates, and therefore must be trained to create consciously. It is the patience of returning again and again to the vision, even when the old tries to reassert itself. Discipline is both firmness and gentleness, a steady guiding of the imagination until it naturally dwells only upon what serves the new creation. The promise of transformation is bound to the act of intentional forgetting, for it is through forgetting the old that man awakens to a higher state of being. The law of consciousness is exact what you dwell upon, you become. If you continually recall the old state, you sustain it. If you deliberately forget it and abide the new, you prove the law and witness transformation. The promise is certain because consciousness never fails to outpicture what is assumed. When you forget the former things and remember only the new identity, you shift the foundation of your being, and life reorganizes itself to reflect it. Transformation is not chance, nor is it bestowed from without. It is the inevitable result of intentional forgetting and sustained assumption. The old self is nothing more than a collection of memories. These memories, rehearsed again and again, weave together the sense of identity. A man who constantly recalls his failures thinks of himself as a failure. A woman who continually remembers her illnesses sees herself as sick. Their world mirrors back what they have chosen to remember. But when the old memories are intentionally forgotten, the entire structure of self begins to dissolve. In the absence of remembrance, the past loses its power, and the new self can emerge. Forgetting is self the act of dying to the old, and transformation is the resurrection into the new. The promise of transformation is that man can rise above every limitation by chain tape in which he dwells. No chain of circumstance, no history of failure, no testimony of the senses can bind the one who forgets and assumes anew. This is the gift of the law. It responds, not to what was, but to what is now assumed. By forgetting the old identity and living from the new, man demonstrates the creative power of imagination. Each deliberate act of forgetting proves the law, for what once held him captive no longer appears in his experience. The higher state is all distant. It is always present, waiting to be occupied. Forgetting is the doorway. Transformation begins the moment you decide to withdraw attention from the old state. Attention is the lifeblood of any condition, and memory is attention directed backward. When you withdraw that attention and refuse to feed the old stories, you cut off their supply. At first, the mind resists, for habit is strong. Memories attempt to intrude, demands to be recognized. But each time you intentionally forget, each time you dismiss the memory and turn you the new assumption, you weaken the old state. Eventually, it fades altogether, and the new state becomes natural. This is the process of awakening to a higher being, and it is guaranteed by the law of consciousness. The promise also lies in the peace that accompanies transformation. The old state is filled with struggle, anxiety, and fear, for it clings to appearance and rehearses lack. But the new state, once assumed, brings rest. To forget the old is to be free from its torment. The mind is no longer burdened by memories of failure or regret. The heart is no longer chained to injuries of the past. Forgetting sets the soul free to live fully in the present, where creation occurs. This peace is the mark of transformation. For the one who has forgotten the old walks with quiet confidence, knowing the law will never fail him. Examples abound of how the promise manifests. A man burdened with years of poverty forgets his lack and begins to imagine wealth. At first, memories of unpaid debts and empty hands press upon him, but he disciplines himself to forget them. He refuses to recall them and instead dwells in the end of abundance. Soon opportunities arise, doors open, and his outer world reflects his inner forgetting. He has proven the law. A woman long after sickness forgets the history of her illness. She refuses to recall the days of pain and identifies only with health. As she forgets the old testimony, her body begins to conform to the new assumption, and she rises to a higher state of being. The law is proven again. In both cases, forgetting was the key, and transformation the promise fulfilled. The promise of transformation also carries a deeper implication. Man is not bound by time. What you were yesterday does not dictate what you are today, unless you remember it. Time itself is shaped by memory, and by forgetting you transcend it. The higher state exists now, not in some distant future. To awaken to it, you need only for the old self and assume the new. This is why transformation appears miraculous. For the world believes change requires long effort and gradual progress. But the law reveals that change occurs the moment the old is forgotten and the new is assumed. The outer world may take time to rearrange, but the inner transformation is immediate. The promise is instantaneous renewal through intentional forgetting. Transformation is also proof of the divine nature of man. When you forget the old and rise into the new, you reveal the creative power of consciousness at work. You demonstrate that you are not a victim of circumstance, but the author of it. Each transformation is a testimony to the law, showing that imagination shapes reality. The higher state is not given from outside, it is chosen within. Each act of forgetting proves this truth, for it shows that nothing has power except what you choose to sustain in consciousness. By forgetting, you claim your authority as the creator of your world. The promise of transformation is universal. It belongs not to a select few but to all, for all share the same consciousness and the same law. Anyone who practices intentional forgetting can awaken to a higher state of being. The degree of transformation depends only on the degree of forgetting. The more thoroughly you release the old, the more completely you rise into the new. This is why forgetting is called the gateway. It is the passage from one state to another, the bridge from what now is. The promise stands sure, for the law is no respecter of persons. Whoever forgets and assumes anew proves it. So tonight, let us practice the sacred art of intentional forgetting. Let us cast off the old man and clothe ourselves in the new. Let us forget the shadows and dwell only in the light of fulfilled desire. And as we do, we shall prove this eternal law, that imagination creates reality, and by forgetting the past, we awaken to the promise of the future.